He thought inviting a quiet woman to the stage would earn him laughter and applause, but before the clock struck 10 minutes, Grandmaster Victor Sterling would wish he had never pointed in her direction. The Crystal Hall of Manhattan Chess Society shimmered beneath golden chandeliers as hundreds of guests settled into velvet seats, their voices blending into the polished hush of wealth and expectation. Marble floors reflected camera lights. Waiters moved silently with sparkling water and silver trays. At the center of it all stood Victor Sterling, America's most celebrated chess champion, a man whose name carried the weight of trophies, endorsements, and televised victories. At 52, with silver at his temples and a tailored navy suit cut so sharply it seemed to command the room, Victor knew exactly how to hold attention. He smiled the way some men draw swords. Tonight's charity exhibition had been sold out for weeks. Sponsors lined the front row. Reporters checked microphones. Young players in pressed jackets leaned forward, eager to witness genius from only a few feet away. Victor welcomed them with practiced warmth, then sharpened his tone just enough to remind everyone who mattered most. Chess, he announced, one hand resting on the board, is a language of precision. Most people admire it. Very few truly understand it. Laughter fluttered politely through the hall. He continued, pacing slowly beneath the spotlight. Every year, I'm asked if ordinary people can challenge masters. The answer is simple. They can sit down. They just can't stay there long. More laughter, louder now. Victor fed on it. He always had. Near the back of the room, unnoticed by nearly everyone, sat Clara Bennett. She wore a plain beige coat folded neatly across her lap, sensible brown shoes, and a soft gray sweater that looked chosen for comfort rather than impression. A canvas tote bag rested beside her chair. In one hand, she held a paper coffee cup gone lukewarm. She had arrived alone, spoken to no one, and taken the last seat in the final row. To the room, she was invisible. To Victor Sterling, she was an opportunity. Tonight, he said, scanning the audience with theatrical patience, we'll make this fun. A camera swung across the crowd. Faces brightened. People straightened in their seats, hoping to be chosen. Victor let the suspense build, then narrowed his eyes toward the rear of the hall. You there, he called, pointing. The lady in gray. Heads turned all at once. Clara slowly looked up. Yes, you, Victor said with a grin. Would you honor us by joining me for a little lesson? The room broke into amused applause. Some guests glanced back at Clara and smiled the way people smile when they expect embarrassment to happen to someone else. Clara remained still for a moment. Her expression did not harden. It did not brighten. It revealed nothing. Beside the aisle, an usher leaned in and whispered that she did not have to go. Clara thanked him softly, then stood. Her movements were calm, unhurried, almost delicate. She picked up her tote bag, set down the empty cup, and walked toward the stage as the crowd watched with eager curiosity. Her shoes made almost no sound on the marble. Victor spread his arms dramatically as she approached. Tell us your name, he said. Clara Bennett, she replied. Her voice was clear, steady, and unexpectedly confident. Victor nodded. Wonderful. Have you played much chess, Miss Bennett? Clara met his gaze for the first time. Enough, she said. Something in the room shifted, so faint most people missed it. But an elderly man seated near the judge's table suddenly sat upright, staring at her face as if he had seen a ghost. The cameras kept rolling. The audience kept smiling. And Grandmaster Victor Sterling, still certain this would be easy, gestured for Clara to take the white pieces. Clara lowered herself into the chair with the same calm care someone might use when sitting at a kitchen table. The polished tournament board gleamed beneath the lights between her and Victor Sterling, every square reflecting the attention of the room. She placed her tote bag beside her feet, folded her hands once in her lap, and waited. Victor remained standing for an extra beat, letting cameras capture the contrast he believed would entertain millions later. Then he sat across from her and pressed the clock with a flourish. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, smiling toward the audience. Ms. Bennett has generously volunteered to help demonstrate the difference between casual interest and mastery. Laughter rolled through the hall again, though softer now. Clara did not react. She simply reached forward and adjusted her king-pawn 1 inch to center it before the game began. Victor noticed the gesture and dismissed it as nerves. White moves first, he said. Take your time. We are in no rush. Clara looked at the board for only a second, then moved her pawn 2 squares. Clean. Direct. No hesitation. Victor answered instantly, matching her in the center. The clocks began their measured ticking, tiny sounds somehow louder than before. Several guests leaned forward. Others checked their phones, expecting the novelty to end quickly. A sponsor near the front row whispered that she might last 5 moves if she was lucky. Victor developed a night with practiced speed, then glanced up with a smile designed for cameras. You have good posture at the board, he said. That already puts you ahead of many amateurs. Clara moved a bishop. Again, no wasted motion. Thank you, she replied. Her tone was polite enough to be mistaken for timid. Victor pushed another piece forward, choosing an aggressive line often used to rattle inexperienced players. He expected confusion. Instead, Clara answered with a quiet pawn move that caused 2 younger players in the audience to exchange surprised looks. It was subtle, useful, and unexpectedly precise. The elderly man near the judge's table narrowed his eyes. His name was Harold Mercer, a retired national arbiter who had spent 40 years watching prodigies rise and collapse under pressure. Something about the rhythm of her hands bothered him. Not because it was wrong, because it was familiar. Victor noticed the audience had grown quieter and decided to reclaim control. Tell us, Ms. Bennett, he said while moving his queen's bishop. What do you do for a living? I teach part-time, Clara answered, then pressed her clock. Children mostly. How lovely, Victor said. Then perhaps tonight will be educational for everyone. A few people laughed, though now it sounded uncertain. Clara studied the board longer this time. Her eyes moved once across the diagonals, once across the center, then she advanced a knight into a square that looked ordinary to most of the room and dangerous to exactly 3 people watching. Harold Mercer sat forward, so suddenly his program slid to the floor. One of the younger commentators blinked twice and scribbled notes. Victor's smile held, but only on the outside. He saw the threat immediately. It was not winning. It was not flashy. It was disciplined, layered, and patient. The move suggested planning several turns ahead. He answered quickly anyway, capturing a pawn to appear unconcerned. Boldness can be charming, he said. It can also be expensive. Clara lifted her gaze to him for a moment. So can arrogance, she said softly. The room did not laugh this time. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Victor's fingers hovered above his next piece a fraction longer than before. He moved, pressed the clock harder than necessary, and leaned back as if nothing had changed. But something had. For the first time that evening, Grandmaster Victor Sterling was no longer playing the crowd. He was playing the woman across from him. Victor Sterling had built a career on reading discomfort before it became danger. He knew when opponents doubted themselves, when they wanted safety, when pride would tempt them into mistakes. But the woman across from him offered none of those signals. Clara Bennett sat with quiet posture and steady breathing, her hands resting lightly beside the board whenever they were not moving a piece. No tapping fingers. No shifting eyes. No nervous smile. It was the stillness of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Victor responded with sharper play, advancing his rook file and creating pressure on her kingside. To the audience, the move looked commanding. A few relieved murmurs returned. They wanted the familiar story back, the champion restoring order after a brief interruption. Clara studied the position for several seconds, then moved a pawn 1 square. Small. Plain. Almost forgettable. Harold Mercer whispered under his breath. No, the young commentator beside him turned. What? Harold never looked away from the board. That was not defense, he said. That was a door. Victor saw it 1 move too late. His next planned attack suddenly led into exchanges that favored her structure, not his momentum. He masked the surprise with a laugh and addressed the room. Sometimes beginners stumble into practical ideas, he said. It happens. Clara did not glance up. She developed her rook and pressed the clock. Tick, tick, tick. The sound now seemed to belong to Victor more than to the game. He shifted in his chair and reached for water. Cameras zoomed tighter. Sponsors stopped whispering. In the back rows, several club players had open notation apps on their phones, trying to follow lines they had not expected to need. Victor chose complexity, sacrificing a pawn to create tactical chances. It was bold, dangerous, and exactly the sort of move that had broken dozens of opponents who feared his reputation before they feared the board. Clara leaned closer for the first time. Her eyes moved across the diagonals, then to the center, then back to the edge where the trap hid. She smiled faintly, not with amusement, but recognition. Then she declined the pawn entirely and made a move so quiet the audience almost missed it. Harold Mercer closed his eyes for 1 second. "Mercy," he whispered. Victor stared. The move ignored the bait, improved her position, and threatened 3 future problems at once. It was not flashy enough for casual viewers, but to anyone who understood chess, it was ruthless. Victor's jaw tightened. "Interesting," he said, though the word came out dry. He searched for initiative and found only complications of his own making. He traded bishops. Clara recaptured perfectly. He activated his queen. Clara centralized a knight that now touched half the board like a hand closing around light. The room grew steadily quieter. One of the reporters lowered his microphone. Even the waitstaff near the rear doors had stopped moving. Victor tried humor again. "You said you teach children, Miss Bennett. Do they know you disappear on weekends to terrorize grandmasters?" A few nervous laughs flickered and died. Clara answered, without looking up, "I teach them patience first." She moved her queen. Gasps scattered across the hall. Victor's king was not in immediate danger, which somehow made it worse. Every escape square had begun to shrink. Every active piece he owned had become a future target. He checked the clock and saw that he had spent nearly 7 minutes. She had used less than 3. Sweat formed near his temple beneath the bright lights. He wiped it quickly, but not before cameras caught the gesture. Harold Mercer slowly rose to his feet. The commentator tugged his sleeve. "Do you know her?" Harold's eyes remained fixed on Clara. "I know those hands," he said. "I watched them beat champions before she was old enough to drive." Across the board, Victor finally understood what the room was beginning to suspect. This was no lucky guest. This was someone who had let him speak too long. Victor Sterling no longer looked at the audience. The room that had fed his confidence now felt far away, dimmed behind the 64 squares in front of him. He leaned toward the board, elbows close, studying lines with the intensity of a man searching for a door in a house he thought he owned. Clara Bennett remained composed, hands folded lightly, eyes patient. She had not hurried once. She had not celebrated once. She simply waited while the clock consumed his certainty second by second. Victor chose the most practical continuation he could find, exchanging queens to reduce danger and steer the game toward an endgame he trusted himself to win. It was the move of experience, the move of a champion refusing panic. Clara nodded almost imperceptibly, as though she had expected nothing else, and completed the trade in 2 smooth motions. The board simplified. To casual viewers, relief returned. Pieces came off. Threats seemed smaller. Some whispered that the champion had stabilized everything. Harold Mercer did not sit down. "No," he murmured. He just walked deeper. The commentator beside him frowned. "But queens are gone." Harold's voice stayed low. So is his noise. Victor reached for another piece and froze halfway. Without queens on the board, Clara's knight and rook had become terrifyingly coordinated. His pawns were split. Her king was already active. Tiny weaknesses he had ignored while attacking now stood exposed like cracks in glass. He moved a rook to defend one side. Clara instantly shifted pressure to the other. He advanced a pawn to create counterplay. Clara captured a different pawn entirely. Every attempt to solve one problem gave birth to another. The audience sensed it before they understood it. There is a silence unique to rooms watching power change hands. It begins with fewer coughs, fewer whispers, fewer movements in seats. Then it becomes a tension so complete it almost sounds like weather stopping. That silence now filled Crystal Hall. Victor checked the clock again. 4 minutes remained. Clara had more than 17. He forced a smile that convinced no one. "You are quite resourceful, Miss Bennett." Clara moved her rook behind a passed pawn. "Thank you," she said. "You are quite talkative." A few startled laughs escaped before dying just as quickly. Victor's face tightened. He pushed his chair back an inch, then leaned in again. For the first time in years, he looked older than his age. The polished certainty was gone, replaced by a man doing difficult arithmetic under bright lights. He found a tactical trick at last, a narrow sequence that could win her advanced pawn and perhaps save the draw. His fingers moved quickly. The piece landed with confidence. Some in the crowd exhaled. Clara studied the board longer than before. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then she looked up at Victor with an expression almost kind. "That would have worked," she said softly, "if you had not taught yourself to underestimate people." She moved her knight. Gasps spread across the hall. Victor's tactic collapsed instantly. Worse, his rook was trapped, his king cut off, and her pawn now marched with support. He stared at the board without blinking. Cameras zoomed closer. A sponsor in the front row removed his glasses and cleaned them just to buy time from what he was seeing. Harold Mercer stepped toward the stage rail, voice trembling with certainty now. "I know who she is." Several heads turned. "That is Evelyn Cross," he said. "The prodigy from Chicago. The girl who vanished after beating 3 masters before turning 18. Murmurs rippled like wind through dry leaves. Victor heard every word. He looked at Clara again, truly looked this time, as if searching past the gray sweater and plain shoes for the history he had mocked. Clara did not confirm it. She simply pressed her clock. Tick. Victor had less than 3 minutes left, a losing position, and an audience that no longer belonged to him. Victor Sterling had spent decades making other people feel the weight of his name. Tonight, for the first time, he felt the weight of it himself. Every camera in Crystal Hall remained fixed on his face, searching for cracks beneath the polished image America had admired for years. His hand hovered above the board, withdrew, then hovered again. 3 legal moves were available. 2 lost quickly. 1 delayed the inevitable. He chose delay. Clara Bennett answered at once, sliding her rook to the 7th rank with a precision so natural it looked effortless. The audience did not cheer. They were beyond cheering now. They were witnessing something rarer than victory. They were watching arrogance understand itself. Victor swallowed, then forced another move. Clara advanced her passed pawn 1 square. The small wooden piece now stood only steps from promotion, protected by king and rook, impossible to stop without surrendering everything else. "Remarkable," Victor said, though his voice sounded borrowed. "You hid rather well." Clara kept her eyes on the board. "I was not hiding," she replied. "I was living." The words landed harder than any insult could have. Murmurs drifted through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. Several younger players in the audience stared at Clara with the kind of awe reserved for legends and possibilities. Harold Mercer moved closer to the stage rail, unable to remain still. "Evelyn Cross," he said again, more firmly now. "I watched her in St. Louis when she was 17. She beat a Grandmaster in 26 moves and apologized for making him wait." Victor heard him and closed his eyes for 1 brief second. Memory moved through the room like electricity. Some older guests now recognized the name. Articles had once called her the future of American chess. Then, without warning, she disappeared from competition. Rumors replaced facts. Burnout, illness, scandal, marriage. No one had known. Clara made no effort to claim the identity or deny it. She simply pressed her clock. Tick. Victor's time fell under 2 minutes. Sweat darkened the collar of his tailored shirt. The famous composure, the elegant timing, the theatrical smile that had controlled so many nights like this had all abandoned him. He searched for tricks one last time and sacrificed his rook for her pawn, hoping for perpetual checks, confusion, miracle geometry. Clara had already seen it. She stepped her king calmly to safety, then centralized her knight with a move so clean that several masters in the front row shook their heads in admiration. Victor looked at the board, then at Clara, then back again. "Why come here dressed like this?" he asked quietly. No microphone now, no performance left. Clara's answer was gentle. "Because clothing should not be an entrance exam." A hush fell deeper than before. Even Victor seemed to feel the truth of it. He gave 1 final check. Clara blocked. He moved again. Clara captured. His last active piece disappeared from the board, and with it, the final illusion that experience alone could save him. The position was now mathematically hopeless. His king stood boxed in by elegant coordination, every square denied by patient planning. The digital clock beside him blinked 1:14. Clara still had over 15 minutes. Victor leaned back slowly. The man who had called her forward for entertainment now sat as the lesson himself. Across the front row, a sponsor who had laughed earliest now stared at his shoes. A young girl in a chess club jacket clasped her hands and smiled, as if seeing the future change shape. Clara adjusted 1 piece, then rested her fingertips beside the board. She did not rush the ending. Masters know that the final move is not only technical, it is moral. Victor looked up at her, stripped now of sarcasm, title, and distance. "Who are you really?" he asked. Clara met his eyes with calm steadiness. "Someone you should have greeted. Politely." Then she reached for her queen's pawn and moved. The pawn Clara had moved looked harmless to anyone who did not understand endings. To those who did, it was the closing sentence of a long argument. Victor Sterling studied the board in silence, his eyes tracing squares already lost to geometry and patience. If he captured the pawn, he would surrender his king's final shelter. If he ignored it, promotion would arrive in moments. If he chased checks, Clara's knight would cut them short. Every path ended at the same door. The clock beside him dropped to 58 seconds. The room listened to each second as if time itself had become part of the punishment. Victor reached for his king and moved one square sideways, choosing survival over dignity. Clara responded instantly, advancing the pawn again. It now stood one rank from becoming a queen. Gasps moved across the hall like a wave. A reporter near the aisle forgot to whisper and said aloud, "This is over." No one corrected him. Victor's hand trembled slightly before settling on a rookless board that offered no mercy. He glanced toward the audience, perhaps searching for the laughter he had owned earlier, perhaps hoping to borrow confidence from faces that once adored him. He found only attention, some sympathetic, some stunned, some quietly satisfied. The crowd had not turned cruel. It had turned honest. "You could have returned years ago," Victor said, voice low enough that only nearby microphones caught it. "The circuit would have welcomed you." Clara's eyes remained on the board. "No," she said softly. "The circuit welcomed ratings. It welcomed headlines. It welcomed men who enjoyed humiliating strangers." Victor flinched as if the truth had arrived from a direction he had not defended. Clara continued, not bitter, only clear. "I left because I forgot why I loved the game. I came tonight because children I teach wanted to see a real tournament hall." Several people in the audience straightened in their seats. A few looked embarrassed to be hearing this now rather than earlier. "They could not afford tickets," Clara said. "So I bought one seat and stood in line for hours." Harold Mercer removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. "Good Lord," he whispered. Victor stared at her plain sweater, the worn shoes, the canvas bag beside her chair. What he had dismissed as insignificance had been sacrifice. What he had mocked as simplicity had been priorities. His clock fell to 31 seconds. He made another move, not because it helped, but because surrender had always seemed easier when it belonged to someone else. Clara slid her knight into place. The move was elegant, final, and impossible to misunderstand. Victor's king had one legal square left. One. Cameras leaned closer. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold still. Victor found the square and moved there with the care of a man signing something irreversible. Clara looked at the board one last time, then at Victor. There was no triumph in her face, no cruelty, no hunger for revenge. Only composure. She promoted the pawn to a queen, set the new piece down gently, and with one smooth motion delivered checkmate. The words were not dramatic when she spoke them. They were almost kind. "Checkmate, Mr. Sterling." The room went silent in a way no applause ever could. Victor looked at the board for several seconds, then slowly removed his hand from the piece he had been touching. The champion who had spent a lifetime speaking first had nothing left to say. Then, from somewhere near the back, one person began to clap. Another joined. Then another. The sound grew, not wild or mocking, but respectful, rising into a standing ovation that rolled through Crystal Hall like overdue weather. It was not for humiliation. It was for mastery without vanity. Victor remained seated while the entire room stood for the woman he had invited as a joke. Clara gathered her tote bag, adjusted the sleeve of her sweater, and rose quietly from the table. She did not bow to the crowd. She did not pose for cameras. She simply thanked the arbiter, nodded once to Harold Mercer, and turned toward the aisle as applause followed her like truth catching up. Clara Bennett had nearly reached the aisle when she heard the chair legs scrape behind her. The applause was still rolling through Crystal Hall, but it softened as people noticed Victor Sterling. Rising at last. Champions are often measured by victories, yet rooms remember them more clearly by what they do after defeat. Victor stepped away from the table without his usual theatrical ease. His jacket hung slightly open, his tie loosened by the heat of pressure and consequence. For a moment he seemed older, not in years, but in honesty. "Ms. Bennett," he called. Clara stopped and turned. The hall fell quiet again. Cameras pivoted instantly. Victor walked a few steps toward her, then stopped at a respectful distance. Earlier that evening he had pointed at her, as if summoning entertainment. Now he stood with empty hands and no script. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, but real. No sponsor could have purchased that sentence from him an hour earlier. Clara waited, saying nothing. Victor glanced around the room, then back to her. "I treated you like a prop. I judged you by your clothes, by your seat in the back row, by the story I wanted the crowd to enjoy." He swallowed once. "And I was wrong." No one moved. Even reporters lowered their pens. Some moments become fragile when truth enters them. Clara studied him carefully. She had seen arrogance all evening, but now she was deciding whether humility had finally arrived or merely changed costumes. "Why did you really call me up there?" she asked. Victor answered without delay. "Because I thought making someone smaller would make me seem larger." A murmur passed through the audience. It was the kind of sentence many people know privately and few ever say aloud. Clara nodded once. "That is expensive wisdom," she said. Victor gave a faint smile touched with regret. "You charged a fair price." Light laughter broke the tension, warm this time. Harold Mercer approached from the judges' section, moving with the quick energy of a man 20 years younger than he was. "Evelyn Cross," he said, stopping before Clara with bright eyes. "I knew at the moment you placed that knight on move 12. Clara smiled gently. "Hello, Harold." The room erupted again, not with shock now, but delight. The mystery was confirmed. Reporters nearly stumbled over one another. Phones lifted across the hall. Yet Clara did not bask in it. She greeted Harold the way one greets an old teacher at a grocery store. Simple. Human. "You vanished," Harold said. Half the chess world spent years wondering why. Clara looked around the grand hall, the lights, the banners, the expensive suits, the hungry cameras. "Because I was becoming famous," she said, "and forgetting how to be happy." The sentence landed heavier than any trophy. Victor lowered his gaze. He understood more than he wished to. Clara continued, not to shame him, but to finish the lesson. "I teach children now. Some of them come from neighborhoods where no one expects brilliance. They arrive shy, underdressed, uncertain. If I let people like you decide who belongs, they never sit at the board." Several sponsors looked visibly uncomfortable. One woman in pearls quietly removed her event badge and placed it in her purse. Victor straightened, then turned toward the audience. "Then I have something to correct." He walked back to the microphone at center stage. The same microphone he had used for jokes and applause lines now waited for something better. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice steady, "the Manhattan Chess Society Scholarship Fund receives my entire appearance fee tonight." Gasps rose again. "And beginning next month, we will host free weekend instruction for public school students, led by coaches who understand respect." He looked toward Clara. "If Ms. Bennett ever wishes to advise us, we would be fortunate." The crowd rose once more, louder than before. Not for victory, for repair. Clara considered him, then gave the smallest nod. "Teach them to greet every player the same way," she said. "Then we can talk." Victor bowed his head once. This time, no one laughed. The crowd remained standing long after the applause should have ended. Some people clapped because they were impressed. Others clapped because they had been reminded of something they had forgotten. In Crystal Hall, where polished shoes and expensive names usually moved with certainty, many now stood uncertain in the best possible way. Clara Bennett did not return to center stage. She moved quietly toward the side aisle, tote bag over one shoulder, as if the evening were finished for her. To Clara, it almost was. She had not come for revenge. She had come to show a few children that doors can open even when people stand in front of them. Near the exit, 3 young students in matching chess club jackets hesitated beside a velvet rope. They could not have been older than 12. Their coach, a tired-looking public school teacher wearing a bargain suit and hopeful eyes, seemed unsure whether to approach. Clara noticed them first. "Did you enjoy the game?" she asked. The smallest boy nodded so hard his glasses slipped down his nose. "Ma'am," he said, voice shaking. "I did not know someone could be calm like that." Clara smiled. "That is because many people confuse noise with strength." The girl beside him clutched a scorebook against her chest. "Were you scared?" she asked. Clara considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said. "But fear is not a stop sign. It is only information." The children stared as if she had handed them treasure. Their coach introduced himself as Mr. Leonard Hayes from Queens Public School District. He explained that his team practiced in a cafeteria, because their library had become storage space. They shared clocks, borrowed boards, and raised bus money with bake sales. They wanted to see this hall one time, he said softly. I told them maybe next year. Clara glanced back at the chandeliers, the banners, the carved wood, the abundance that had nearly missed its chance to matter. Then she looked toward Victor Sterling, who was still speaking quietly with event organizers near the stage. Mr. Hayes, she said, would your students use a permanent place to train? The man blinked. Every day. Clara nodded once and walked back toward center stage before anyone understood why. Conversation stopped as she approached the microphone. Victor stepped aside immediately. She did not touch the microphone at first. She simply looked across the room, letting the silence gather itself. This hall is beautiful, she said at last. But beauty becomes expensive emptiness when only certain people are welcomed inside. No one shifted. No one coughed. I would like to rent this space. Every Saturday morning for 1 year, she continued, for free youth instruction, public school tournaments, and open lessons for any child who wishes to learn. Audible gasps moved through the audience. The board president nearly dropped his folder. Clara continued as calmly as if discussing groceries. I will cover the cost anonymously if necessary, though anonymity appears to be over. Laughter burst out warm and grateful. Victor Sterling stepped forward. No, he said firmly. The society will donate the hall. We can afford to learn too. Applause thundered again. Several sponsors immediately raised their hands, pledging clocks, books, transportation funds, scholarships, laptops, meals. One woman who had laughed early in the night promised uniforms for every public school team in the city. Another donor offered to renovate the Queen's School Library. The generosity arrived quickly, but it had been waiting for permission. Sometimes all wealth needs is a better example. Clara turned back to the 3 children near the rope. You asked if I was scared, she said to the girl. Tonight I was. But I was more tired of doors. The girl smiled through tears she did not seem embarrassed to have. Victor moved beside Clara, not ahead of her, and addressed the room one final time. Starting now, he said, every exhibition begins with open seats in the front row for students who earned them, not guests who bought them. The room rose once more. Clara simply picked up her tote bag. Greatness had entered quietly, changed the furniture of power, and was already heading home. By the time Clara Bennett stepped out into the Manhattan night, a light spring rain had begun to fall. The city sidewalks shone beneath street lamps like polished stone, and yellow cabs hissed past in long ribbons of reflected gold. Behind her, Crystal Hall still buzzed with reporters, donors, and stunned guests trying to explain what they had witnessed. But Clara preferred the sound of rain. It asked nothing from anyone. She walked 2 blocks to a modest corner diner that stayed open late and served coffee strong enough to forgive hard days. Inside, 3 children and their coach were already waiting in. A booth near the window, still wearing their chess club jackets, still too excited to sit properly. Mr. Leonard Hayes stood when she entered. We did not want to bother you, he said. Clara smiled. Then you should have ordered pie first. That would have softened the offense. The children laughed, and the room relaxed. They spent the next hour not discussing fame, sponsors, or headlines, but forks, openings, blunders, and why nights confuse beginners. Clara drew positions on napkins. She showed the smallest boy how to use the center. She taught the girl with the scorebook that losing quickly is sometimes faster learning than winning slowly. She reminded them that clocks measure time, not worth. Outside, camera crews waited at the curb, but no one inside cared. Meanwhile, back at Crystal Hall, Victor Sterling sat alone at the now empty board. The chandeliers had dimmed. Staff moved quietly in the distance. The same table where he had expected applause now held only pieces reset to their starting squares. He stared at them for a long time. Every pawn equal. Every side identical until behavior changed the story. Harold Mercer approached carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He placed one beside Victor without speaking. I deserved worse tonight, Victor said eventually. Harold shrugged. Perhaps, but worse teaches less. Victor looked down. Do people come back from becoming that kind of man? Harold sipped his coffee. Only if they stop protecting him. Weeks passed. Then months. On the first Saturday of summer, Crystal Hall opened its front doors at 8 in the morning to a line that wrapped around the block. Public school students arrived carrying backpacks, borrowed boards, homemade notation sheets, and dreams no longer required invitation. Volunteers handed out breakfast sandwiches and fruit. Sponsors who once bought front-row prestige now funded bus routes from every borough. Mr. Hayes's students sprinted across the marble floor like they belonged there, because now they did. Above the entrance hung a new brass plaque. Welcome, every player. Clara arrived carrying the same canvas tote bag. No cameras had been invited, yet some appeared anyway. She ignored them. All. Inside the main room, rows of tables stretched beneath the chandeliers. At the front stood Victor Sterling in a simple sweater with no title on the name tag, arranging scorebooks and plugging in clocks. When he saw Clara, he nodded respectfully. Good morning, Coach Bennett. She set down her bag. Good morning, Volunteer Sterling. The children nearby burst into laughter. Victor laughed too, perhaps the healthiest sound anyone had ever heard from him. Throughout the day, Clara taught strategy. Victor taught endgames. Harold told stories about famous players who once lost badly and learned well. By noon, the hall that had once hosted exclusion now echoed with concentration, spilled pencils, whispered plans, and the bright noise of opportunity. Near closing time, the young girl with the scorebook approached Clara after winning her first tournament game. Do you think I can become a master someday? She asked. Clara crouched to meet her eyes. That depends, she said gently. Can you stay humble while getting stronger? The girl thought seriously, then nodded. Then yes, Clara said. As evening light poured through the tall windows, Victor looked across the room at children filling every table and understood the finest match of his life had begun only after he lost one. And that day, in a hall built for prestige, everyone remembered what dignity looks like.